Hey everyone, welcome back for another deep dive. We've all been hearing a ton about how divided America is these days, right?
Yeah.
And it kind of makes you wonder, are we actually on the verge of another civil war?
It's a question a lot of people are asking.
So today, we're going to try to get to the bottom of this, really unpack it. We've got some really interesting stuff to dig into. We've got these two experts, Sullivan and Blenkinsop, kind of going head-to-head in these opinion pieces.
Yeah, very different perspectives.
Totally different takes. And then on top of that, we found this academic paper analyzing past secession attempts in America.
Which is fascinating stuff.
Super interesting. So we're going to see if we can cut through all the noise and figure out what's really going on here. Historically, what's at stake here?
Right, because it's not just about today, it's about understanding the DNA of America.
Exactly. So to pick things off, let's jump into Sullivan's take on this whole thing. And whoa, he does not hold back. He paints some pretty intense scenarios, almost like something out of a dystopian movie.
Yeah, he gets your attention.
Oh yeah, for sure. He talks about this idea of oil vigilantes. So imagine this. A cyber attack cripples fuel pipelines, right?
Yeah.
People are freaking out. Gas is scarce.
Chaos.
Total chaos. And Sullivan says people, just everyday citizens, pushed to the brink, they might take matters into their own hands. And he specifically says they might go after Google.
Believing they're behind it, yeah.
Because in his scenario, I guess Google is this super powerful corporation controlling everything.
It's like the ultimate symbol of tech dominance in his view.
Right, and it's not just that. He also talks about this standoff between the federal government and some city that's declared itself sovereign, refusing to pay taxes or whatever.
Oh yeah, he calls it a sovereign city, and they're basically telling the IRS to get lost.
Exactly. It's wild. But here's the thing that kind of freaks me out. These scenarios, as crazy as they sound, they're not totally out there, right?
Yeah.
We're seeing this rise in extremist rhetoric, distrust in institutions.
And those standoffs you mentioned, they're based on real events, like those armed standoffs over land rights and stuff.
Yeah, exactly. Makes you think, are we closer to this kind of thing than we realize?
Well, and I think that's Sullivan's point. He's not saying these exact things will happen, but he's saying, hey, this is plausible, people. We need to wake up and pay attention.
Yeah, it's like a warning. Okay, so we've got Sullivan over here sounding the alarm bells, and then we've got Blenkinsop. And he's like the voice of calm, cool-headed reason.
Very data-driven, yeah.
Totally.
Yeah.
And he's basically saying, hold on a second, a civil war in America, highly unlikely. But what's his reasoning? Why is he so sure?
Well, he's looking at it from a historical and, like you said, data-driven perspective. He's using, the political science definition of civil war, which is really specific.
Okay, so how do they actually define it?
It requires a certain level of organization, you need actual organized factions fighting, and a significant death toll. We're talking large-scale, sustained violence, not just isolated incidents.
So, those horrible mass shootings and stuff, those wouldn't necessarily qualify.
No, because they're tragic, but they're not a civil war in that strict definition.
Okay, that makes sense. So Blenkinsop's saying America's not there.
Not even close, at least not right now.
All right, so that's a little reassuring, but I can't help but think about, America's past,
Yeah.
We've had periods of intense political violence before. What about the 1960s and 70s?
Absolutely.
Assassinations, bombings, riots.
Right, it was a very tumultuous time.
So how do we square that with what Blenkinsop's saying? How do we not have a civil war then?
Well, both Blenkinsop and Sullivan actually talk about that period, and they both say that even then the U.S. didn't descend into a full-blown civil war. Because the scale and organization just weren't there. There was a lot of unrest, for sure, but it never reached the level of a full-blown civil war.
Okay, so maybe we're just, hardwired to worry about this, even if it's statistically unlikely.
It's not an unreasonable worry, though. Even Blenkinsop, while he's looking at the statistics, he says there are some parallels to the 60s that are a little concerning.
Oh, really? Like what?
Well, he specifically mentions the attempted assassination of former President Trump.
Yeah, that was a crazy story.
He brings that up as a potential catalyst for more unrest.
Oh, wow. So that's where things get a little eerie. And Sullivan, he goes even further, right? He says that event, that attempted assassination, is like a major warning sign, especially if people believe, that it was politically motivated.
Right, he's talking about the potential for cascading consequences. Like, say that narrative takes hold, people start believing it was orchestrated by political opponents.
And the conspiracies start flying.
Exactly. Calls for retaliation, distrust in institutions just grows even more. He says that's the kind of thing that can push things closer to the edge.
So it's not just about the act itself, it's about what it could unleash.
Precisely. It's like a match near a powder keg. And Sullivan, he even says that the way some on the left talk about their opponents, like they're the enemy, that's contributing to this climate of fear and potential violence. He even specifically mentions the word apocalyptic being thrown around a lot.
Oh, wow. So he's drawing a line between rhetoric and violence.
He is. He's saying words have power, and when you demonize the other side, you make violence more likely. He doesn't let Trump off the hook either, by the way.
Oh, yeah.
Oh, yeah. He brings up all that stuff Trump was saying about what would happen if he lost, like all that talk about the election being stolen.
Yeah.
He seems to be saying both sides are guilty of ramping up the tension with the way they talk.
Interesting. So like this feedback loop of aggression, almost.
Yeah, exactly.
But Blenkinsop, he doesn't really buy that, does he?
He doesn't see it that way. He pushes back on that whole narrative about the assassination attempt being part of some larger plot. He says it was more likely a case of stochastic terrorism.
Stochastic terrorism. Okay. First time I'm hearing that term. What is that exactly?
So it's basically like unpredictable violence from a lone wolf, someone who's been radicalized, but not necessarily part of a larger organization.
So like a one-off thing, not orchestrated.
Right. Inspired by rhetoric maybe, but not directed by any group.
Okay, so how do we even know which it is? Like, how do we differentiate between an isolated act and something that's like a sign of something bigger brewing?
That's the million-dollar question, right? And it's really difficult to answer. You have to look at the broader context. Are there signs of organization? Is there a clear ideology driving the violence? Those are the kinds of things you have to consider.
Okay, so we've got these two very different takes, Sullivan, with this. Like, stark warning, and Blenkinsop saying, hold on, let's look at the data. But it feels like we're missing a big piece of the puzzle here. America's history.
Absolutely. I mean, we can't talk about this without looking back at how America has dealt with these kinds of divisions in the past.
Right, because haven't we been here before in some ways?
Oh, absolutely. And that's where this academic paper comes in. It's actually really eye-opening because it digs into America's history with secessionist movements.
Oh, interesting. And what's the takeaway there?
Well, the big takeaway is this. The idea of a divided America, states going their own way, that's not new, at all. It's been around since the very beginning.
Really?
Yeah, and we'll dive more into that in just a bit.
Okay, so we're going back in time now, huh?
That's right, we're gonna do a little time traveling.
Back to the future, but the past.
Exactly.
We're looking at America's history of secession. See if it can tell us anything about what's going on today.
Right, because it's more complicated than a lot of people realize.
So this academic paper we found.
Yeah, what'd you think?
Super fascinating. I had no idea that the idea of a divided America, states actually breaking away, had been around for so long.
Oh, it's a recurring theme in American history.
Really? I mean, I always think of, the Civil War and the Confederacy, but you're saying there's more to it.
Way more.
Like what?
Okay, well, think about it. Even before the United States existed, you can argue that the American Revolution itself was an act of secession.
Oh, that's true. The colonies breaking away from England.
Right.
So it's baked into our DNA from the very beginning, this idea of separating if you don't like how things are going.
Exactly. And that sentiment didn't just disappear after independence.
Okay, so tell me more about these other attempts at secession. What were some of the big ones?
Well, one really interesting example is the New England Federalists.
The what?
The New England Federalists, back in the early 1800s.
Okay, and what happened there?
So they were really unhappy with the policies of the Jeffersonian Republicans, especially during the War of 1812.
Because it was a disaster for New England's economy.
Exactly. Their ships were being seized, trade was disrupted, it was a mess. They felt like their interests were being ignored, and they saw secession as a way to protect themselves.
Wow, so they were serious.
Oh, yeah. They even held a secret convention to discuss it.
No way. A secret convention?
Yep, hush-hush, the whole 9 yards.
So what were their main grievances? What were they hoping to achieve by breaking away?
Their big thing was states' rights.
States' rights?
Yeah, they believed the federal government was becoming too powerful, too intrusive, and they wanted more autonomy for individual states.
Interesting. And isn't that the same argument that was used later on by the Confederacy?
Exactly. It's a recurring theme, this tension between federal power and states' rights.
Wow. So it's history rhyming, not repeating, but definitely rhyming.
That's a great way to put it.
So we've got the New England Federalists. Any other notable secession attempts?
Another interesting case is the Garrisonian abolitionists.
The abolitionists.
Right.
But they were against slavery, right?
Right, they were radical abolitionists, and they believed the U.S. Constitution was pro-slavery.
So they wanted to secede to abolish slavery.
Exactly. They wanted to create a separate nation free from the stain of slavery.
Wow, that's wild. So it wasn't just about pro-slavery versus anti-slavery. It was more nuanced than that.
Way more nuanced.
It's like secession was being used as a tool by both sides for totally different reasons.
Exactly. It highlights how secession has often been more about a deep dissatisfaction with the status quo than any one specific ideology.
So if these divisions, these impulses to break away, have always been a part of America, then what's kept us together all this time?
That's a great question.
Seriously, what's the glue?
Well, that's where the idea of national identity comes in.
All right, so we're back, wrapping up our deep dive here into this whole question of, like, is another civil war really possible in America?
A lot to unpack.
Yeah, we've covered a lot of ground, huh? Intense scenarios, the statistics, and then, wow, that whole history of secession in America, like, who knew?
Really makes you think.
So where do we even begin to, like, sum this all up? What's the takeaway for our listeners?
Well, if we take a step back and look at everything we've talked about, a few key things stand out.
Okay, like what?
First, while an actual civil war, like armies fighting on battlefields, that seems pretty unlikely right now.
Right, statistically speaking at least.
Right. But, and this is important, the risk of like smaller scale political violence, that's definitely something to take seriously.
Yeah, it feels like we're in this weird in-between space, right? Where all-out war seems far-fetched, but then like every day there's some news story about like protests turning violent or threats against politicians, and it's just like unnerving.
Exactly. It's this undercurrent of tension that's hard to ignore.
Yeah, totally. And I guess that's why looking at history is so important, right? Like, we learned that this whole idea of a divided America, it's not new at all.
Nope. It's been there from the beginning, bubbling under the surface.
And it makes you wonder, like, what is it about America? Why do we always seem to be grappling with these divisions?
Well, I think it goes back to what we were talking about earlier, this constant tension between individual liberty and collective unity.
Right, like finding that balance between, like, states' rights and federal power.
Exactly. And then you have all the different values, beliefs, and backgrounds. It's a lot to hold together.
It really is.
Yeah.
So if these divisions have always been there, what is it then that's kept America from completely falling apart?
That's the million-dollar question, right?
For real.
And I think a big part of it is this idea of a shared American identity.
A shared identity. What does that even mean, though? Like, is it our history, our values?
It's a good question, and it's complex because unlike a lot of other countries, America wasn't built on a shared ethnicity, language, or religion, you know?
That's true. We're a nation of immigrants.
Exactly. So it's more about like an idea, an aspiration embodied in things like the Constitution, the Declaration of Independence.
Right, right. Like all men are created equal, all that good stuff.
Exactly. Those ideals, the pursuit of them, that's a powerful unifying force, I think.
But then we don't always agree on what those ideals mean.
Yeah.
Or how to achieve them.
Exactly. And that's where things get complicated. But even in that disagreement, that struggle, there's something kind of inherently American, you know? This ongoing debate about what it means to be an American.
I see what you mean. So it's not just about the ideals themselves, but our willingness to keep striving for them, even when it's messy, even when we disagree.
Exactly. And I think that's why this whole conversation, this deep dive we've been doing, it's so important, because if we lose sight of those shared ideals, if we stop talking to each other, stop listening,
we risk falling apart at the seams.
Exactly. The future of America, it's not predetermined. It's on us to decide what it looks like.
Wow. That's a powerful thought to end on. It all comes down to us, huh?
We the people.
Well said. Well, on that note, thanks for joining us for another deep dive. And until next time, keep asking those tough questions and keep the conversation going.